Voters place their trust in Canada's new government's plan. We accept their support with humility.
For decades in this business, I have watched political leaders come and go. But what happened in Canada on the night of April 13th, 2026, is the kind of shift that does not come along often. A prime minister who entered office just 13 months ago, written off by most as a temporary caretaker, just crossed the threshold that changes everything. And the question you need to stay with me for, because it matters far beyond Canada's borders, is what Mark Carney is going to do with this power now that no one in Ottawa can take it away from him. Let me take you back to Monday evening, April 13th, 2026. 3 federal by-elections were called for seats that had opened up in the House of Commons. On paper, it looked like a routine parliamentary housekeeping exercise. 2 of the ridings, University Rosedale and Scarborough Southwest, both in Toronto, were long-standing Liberal strongholds. The third, Terrebonne, a suburban Montreal riding, was a tighter contest. Nobody expected drama. What the country got instead was a political earthquake. When the results came in, the Liberals had swept all 3. Danielle Martin won University Rosedale. Dolly Begum took Scarborough Southwest. And in a result that was genuinely uncertain for hours, 25-year-old Tatiana Auguste, a Haitian-born candidate, won Terrebonne, a riding that had historically leaned toward the Bloc Québécois. With those 3 wins, combined with 5 floor crossings from opposition members over the preceding 5 months, Mark Carney's Liberal Party reached 174 seats in the 343-seat House of Commons. The threshold for a majority government is 172. Canada, for the first time since 2019, had a majority government. That number, 174, sounds simple. But in parliamentary politics, the difference between 171 seats and 174 seats is not 3 votes. It is the difference between a government that governs on borrowed time and a government that governs with confidence. Before Monday night, Carney needed to court smaller parties on every significant vote. He needed to anticipate opposition maneuvers in parliamentary committees. He needed to factor in the very real possibility that a confidence vote could collapse his government and force an early election. All of that uncertainty, all of that political vulnerability evaporated in a single evening. There is historical weight to this moment worth pausing on. There have been 24 prime ministers in Canada's recorded history. Before the night of April 13th, only 13 of them had ever led their party to a majority of seats in the House of Commons. Mark Carney is now the 14th. He did it in 13 months. He did it without ever having held elected office before becoming prime minister. And he did it in the middle of a trade war with the most powerful country on earth. That context matters. It is not incidental. It is the story. But to understand what this majority actually means, you first have to understand the extraordinary and unlikely sequence of events that produced it. Because Mark Carney's rise to power is not a conventional political story. It is something closer to an accidental revolution. Go back 18 months. The Liberal Party of Canada was in a state of advanced collapse. Justin Trudeau, who had led the party since 2013, was hemorrhaging support. His finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, resigned publicly and dramatically, igniting a caucus revolt. By January 2025, Trudeau announced he would step down as party leader. At that moment, polling showed the Conservatives under Pierre Poilievre with a lead of more than 20 points. The Liberals were broadly expected to lose the coming election, perhaps catastrophically. Then Donald Trump entered the equation. In the opening weeks of 2025, Trump escalated his rhetoric against Canada with a ferocity that startled even seasoned observers. He threatened tariffs. He threatened annexation. He repeatedly referred to Canada as a potential 51st state and to the Canadian Prime Minister as a governor rather than a head of state. For many Canadians, it was not just an economic provocation. It was a cultural insult. And it crystallized the central question of the coming election. Who was best placed to stand up to this pressure? Mark Carney, a former governor of the Bank of Canada, and the only person to have also served as governor of the Bank of England, presented himself as exactly that person. Not a career politician, a crisis manager, an economist who had guided 2 countries through periods of severe financial instability. His campaign framing was disciplined and effective. He told Canadians that Trump was trying to break them so he could own them. That line resonated. The Conservatives lost their 20-point lead within weeks. In the April 2025 election, Carney won. But he fell just short of a majority, landing at 170 seats. Close, but not enough to govern without watching his back. Then came the floor crossings. Between November 2025 and April 2026, 5 opposition MPs defected to the Liberal caucus. 4 were Conservatives. 1 was from the NDP. Each defection was announced separately, each one a small political shock. Critics, including Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, called these crossings backroom deals and questioned their democratic legitimacy. Carney dismissed the criticism and pointed to the by-election results as Democratic confirmation. The voters of Terrebonne, Scarborough Southwest, and University Rosedale had just delivered that confirmation at the ballot box. Now here is where we need to move past the political drama and get into the substance, because a majority government in the Westminster parliamentary system is not merely a symbolic achievement. It is an operational transformation. Under a minority government, the Carney administration needed support from at least one other party to pass legislation. That created constant negotiation. It slowed down the legislative calendar. It meant opposition parties controlled key parliamentary committees, the bodies that scrutinize and amend bills before they reach the floor for a final vote. Committee control is not a minor technical detail. It is one of the most powerful levers in the entire system. When the government does not control committees, the opposition can slow legislation to a crawl. They can invite witnesses hostile to a bill, demand amendments, delay reporting back to the House. With a majority, the Liberals can now take control of those committees. They can set their own legislative timetable. They can pass priority bills in weeks rather than months. They will not face the perpetual threat of a confidence vote collapsing the government. And they can begin planning their agenda not around the next 6 months of political survival, but around the next 3 years of governing. The Carney government has signaled clearly what it intends to do with this freedom. The defense spending agenda, already ambitious, can now be accelerated. Canada committed to reaching the NATO target of 2% of gross domestic product on defense. And with a majority, that commitment no longer requires parliamentary negotiation to implement. The energy agenda, including liquefied natural gas projects in British Columbia and pipeline infrastructure connecting Alberta to the coast, can move without the delays that opposition committee maneuvering previously created. And critically, the USMCA review, the mandatory renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement scheduled for July 2026, can now be approached by a Canadian government that is not looking over its shoulder at its own parliament while simultaneously negotiating with Washington. But that brings us to the dimension of this story that Washington is watching most carefully. The relationship between Donald Trump's administration and Mark Carney's government has been the defining diplomatic tension of the past year. And that majority changes the dynamics of that relationship in ways that are not immediately obvious, but are deeply consequential. Let us be precise about what that relationship has looked like. Trump spent months referring to Canada as a potential 51st state. He imposed tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminium, and automotive products. He threatened at various points to walk away from the USMCA entirely, calling the agreement irrelevant. He threatened to blot the opening of the Gordie Howe International Bridge. He threatened a 100% tariff on Canadian goods over Carney's trade arrangement with China. And his Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, publicly warned Carney not to pick a fight for cheap political points going into the USMCA review, adding a pointed personal remark about technocrats who try to become politicians. Carney absorbed all of this and responded with what he has described as respect but not obsequiousness. He met Trump in the Oval Office. He told reporters he felt better about relations after their meeting. He said Trump understood they were negotiating between sovereign nations. But behind the diplomatic language, every analyst watching this relationship understood that Carney's negotiating position was constrained by his political vulnerability at home. A minority government facing difficult trade negotiations is weaker than it looks. Trump, whatever else you might say about him, is an experienced negotiator who reads leverage. A government that could fall in a confidence vote is a government that may feel pressure to make concessions simply to survive politically. That calculus has now changed. Carney goes into the USMCA review with a mandate that runs until 2029. He cannot be toppled by a parliamentary vote. His approval rating stands at 61%. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, after a well-publicized meeting with Carney that culminated in a shared lunch, publicly stated that the majority gives Carney a stronger hand to negotiate with Trump. That is the assessment of a provincial leader who had earlier disagreed publicly with Carney over the China electric vehicle deal. When your critics are acknowledging your strengthened position, your position is genuinely strengthened. But to understand the full picture, we also need to look at what this moment means for the opposition, because the state of the Conservative Party of Canada is itself a significant factor in how the next 3 years unfold. Pierre Poilievre finds himself in a position that would have been unimaginable 18 months ago. At the start of 2025, he led a party with a commanding lead in the polls, an exhausted governing Liberal Party, and every structural advantage. He was expected to become Prime Minister. Instead, he lost the election. He lost his own parliamentary seat in the process. He secured a leadership review victory earlier in 2026, maintaining his position as Conservative leader, but his numbers have continued to deteriorate. According to polling data reported this week, Poilievre now trails Carney as preferred Prime Minister by 31 percentage points. In response to Monday's results, Poilievre issued a statement arguing that the Liberal majority was not legitimate because it was assembled through floor crossings rather than a general election. He pledged to continue fighting. That response tells us something important. When a political leader responds to an electoral setback by questioning the legitimacy of the result rather than reflecting on why voters are making different choices, it is typically a sign that the strategic reckoning has not yet occurred. Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet offered a more candid assessment when he said there seems to be no alternative about who is to negotiate with Donald Trump. That is not an endorsement of Carney's policies, but it is a frank acknowledgement of political reality. Even in Quebec, where the Liberals are not traditionally dominant, the electorate appears to have concluded that Carney is the most credible figure available to manage the pressure coming from Washington. The NDP, reduced to 6 seats in the House, faces its own identity questions under new leader Avi Lewis, who only took the role 2 weeks ago and does not yet hold a seat in Parliament. The effective opposition to Carney's agenda for the next 3 years is a Conservative Party whose leadership faces serious questions, a bloc with regional limitations, and a left flank whose institutional capacity has been dramatically diminished. What that means in practice is that the constraints on Carney's agenda are no longer primarily parliamentary. They are political, economic, and diplomatic, and that is a very different kind of governing challenge. Now step back from the immediate parliamentary arithmetic and look at what this moment signals on the world stage. Because what happened on April 13th is not just a Canadian domestic story. Over the past 15 months, a remarkable thing has happened. Donald Trump's aggressive posture toward America's closest allies has not produced submission. It has produced consolidation. Canada did not fold under the pressure of annexation threats and tariff escalations. It elected a leader specifically on the platform of resisting that pressure, then gave him a majority to do it with. Trump threatened Denmark over Greenland, and Europe unified in a way it had not in years. Canada reached trade arrangements with China, India, Indonesia, Japan, Australia, and the United Arab Emirates, diversifying its economic relationships with a speed that would have been considered politically impossible just 2 years ago. These are not unconnected events. They are symptoms of the same underlying shift. The assumption that American economic dominance is a permanent and unchallengeable feature of the global order is being tested in real time, and the test results are not uniformly confirming that assumption. Carney said something at Davos in January that bears repeating in this context. He told the assembled leaders of the world that we are living through a rupture, not a transition, a breaking of the fabric that has held international order together for 75 years. He said that countries which are not at the table are on the menu. And then he came home and began systematically ensuring that Canada had seats at as many tables as possible. His Davos speech did not just resonate with international audiences. According to reporting from CBC News, one of the Conservative MPs who crossed the floor to the Liberals cited that speech specifically as a factor in their decision. The ideas Carney articulated about sovereignty, about middle powers coordinating their interests, about the dangers of overdependence on a single economic partner. Those ideas turned out to be not only internationally compelling, but domestically politically potent. That combination is rare, and it now has a parliamentary majority behind it. So where does this go from here? The most immediate question is what Carney does with this majority in the coming weeks and months before the USMCA review begins in July. He told reporters on Tuesday that he is not considering calling a snap general election, stating clearly that Canadians want government to govern. His legislative priorities are coming into focus. Defense spending can now reach the NATO 2% target without parliamentary obstruction. The housing agenda can be accelerated. The online harms legislation, which had stalled in committee, can now be moved through on the government's timeline. And the Canada-U.S. trade relationship, the central challenge of his mandate, enters its most consequential phase. The USMCA review that begins in July will be, as Carney has himself described it, a robust negotiation. Trump's trade representative Jamieson Greer has acknowledged that the deal has load-bearing pillars that function well, but that certain provisions will need to change. The administration has signaled it may seek restrictions on Canada's ability to make independent trade arrangements with China as a condition of the review. Carney has been equally clear that he will not sign a deal that is not in Canada's long-term interest. He said as much after his meeting with Trump, noting that he made clear to the president that Canada would only accept a deal good for Canada, not just in the short term, but in the medium and long term. That is a negotiating position that is considerably more credible today than it was a week ago. A prime minister with a majority government, a 61% approval rating, a diversified trade portfolio, and a mandate running to 2029 is not a negotiator who can be pressured into a quick concession for the sake of political survival. Whether Trump's team has fully absorbed that shift in the balance of the relationship is the question to watch in the weeks ahead. History suggests that Trump responds to strength with a different calculus than he applies to perceived weakness. The next several months will reveal whether Carney can translate parliamentary strength into diplomatic outcomes, and whether the majority that Canadians have now delivered can be converted into a trade framework that reduces the chronic vulnerability that comes from sending 76% of your exports to a single market that has, over the past year, demonstrated that it is willing to weaponize that dependency. What we witnessed on the night of April 13, 2026, was a transfer of political power that was quiet, constitutional, and entirely legal. But its implications are neither quiet nor small. Mark Carney entered this week as a minority prime minister navigating daily political hazards on multiple fronts simultaneously. He exits it as the 14th prime minister in Canadian history to command a parliamentary majority, with the capacity to govern until 2029 without asking permission from his opponents. He enters the most consequential trade negotiation in a generation from a position of genuine stability. And the administration in Washington, which had every incentive to assume that political pressure in Ottawa would limit Carney's ability to hold firm, now faces a Canadian counterpart who is not going anywhere. What Carney does with this mandate will define not just Canada's economic future, but will serve as one of the clearest tests of whether a middle power in the current era can genuinely protect its sovereignty against sustained pressure from a much larger neighbor. That answer is not yet written. But for the first time in this story, Canada is holding the pen.